Thank you. Please feel free to continue eating. That's always a priority for me, so there's no problem with that. So I'm Amy Getz. I'm the Manager of Systems Implementation at the Dana Center. And I'm going to be talking about communications and engagement, which of course came up in our discussion yesterday. And we've also had a number of questions turned in this morning about communications, so I'm going to hopefully address some of those. You're not going to get everything you need in this 30-minute session, but hopefully you'll walk away with some ideas. And also, this can be something where we can have some continued back and forth over the next few months about your needs around communications and what kind of supports there are out there. So there are a number of people in the room who have heard me speak on this several times, and I apologize for the parts that will be repeats. I promise there are a few new things in there, so bear with me for those of you who probably could give this presentation as well as I could. So first of all, I just want to say that the fact that this issue came up so quickly yesterday really pleased me, because often we see people don't think about communications early on. So glad to see many of you are already anticipating this as part of the work. And that's one of the key messages, is that you need to think about communications and engagement early and often, and you have to make a real investment in it. And I don't just mean like investment in terms of money, but investment in terms of time. And that's a challenge, because you're working on all of this other stuff, you're trying to solve problems, and now you've got to find time to go talk about it and tell people. That's difficult, but you will not regret investing that time early and continuously through this process. It will pay off. So first of all, I just want to talk a little bit about why we say both communications and engagement. For many people, when they hear the word communications, they tend to think of it as just disseminating information. Now, it could, of course, mean much more than that, but that's often the way it's interpreted. So if we're thinking about the dissemination of information, that's really good for building awareness. Engagement, though, encourages people to interact with information. It brings them into the process, and it can help build ownership if it's done well. And that's what you really need to do. So both of these have important purposes, and there are different strategies associated with each. It's very important that you think about both. So this is kind of just basics. What do you want to think about when you're thinking about what you're communicating or engaging people around? So there are just some basic questions. Who needs to know the information? What do they need to know specifically? When do they need to know it? You can really mess up communications by giving information at the wrong time. For example, this is just a logistics issue, but if you need to get some information out to university faculty, don't do it at the end of the term. Not a good time. Who should the information come from? This is a tricky question. Sometimes if you are teaching or trying to reach a certain stakeholder group, you want it to come from an authority. It may be some information where they need to know that the authorities are behind, whether that's the agency or their administrators or whoever they look to, that that group is behind this idea. But sometimes it needs to come from colleagues. It needs to come from people within their field, their peers that they respect. Sometimes it needs to come from professional associations. So think carefully, what are the right levers in this outreach? And then what are the best ways to get the information out to them? So one thing, I didn't include this in a slide, and as I was listening to different discussions, it kind of occurred to me this is something we should talk a little bit about, is there's a whole issue of messaging around this. Is often we know what it is we want to say, but we don't really know how to say it, and that's what messaging gets to. So when you're thinking about your messaging, someone brought up yesterday the idea of the storytelling. Tell the story. And that's where you need to think about your audience. What really matters to that audience? So if it's something where you're talking to people within institutions and there's actually something they have to go do, or this is going to impact their work, one thing that's important to them is, are you about to make my job harder? So think about it from that point. How could you actually frame things to help people understand this will actually help them do their job? How could you help make that easier for them to do their job with the information that you're giving them? It might be about what are their greatest concerns or what are their greatest hopes. And the key that crosses all of the different groups you're trying to communicate is that we care about students. So you've been working on a problem statement. That's actually probably one of the first things you need to be thinking about for messaging, is you're going to have to go out and make the case to people that they should be involved in a steering committee or a task force. You might have to make the case to an agency or districts or institutions or philanthropists that they need to help fund some of this. You need to make the case to parents, to faculty. What do they care about? They care about students. And I'll say, when I walked around a lot of the problem statements, I didn't see students in there. So somehow at some point, and I understand that, it's not a criticism because that's where you're at. You have to start where your thinking is. But as you start to refine your problem statement, you need something in there that says something about, this is important for students because, and this is the evidence that we have that we need to do this. And then you always want that hopeful thing in there too. And this is what it will look like. And not that that needs to be a big long thing. In fact, you probably want to keep it fairly short, but you need to communicate to people around what they care about. So think about, in general, as you're working on your messaging all the time, is what's the thing that will get this audience interested, engaged, and invested? Okay, so let's talk about what engagement means. So there are different types of engagement, different types of strategies engage people in different ways. So there might be a number of things that you want to engage people to do. You might want them to process information. So you don't want to just send out a newsletter or an email. But you also don't want to just say, well, maybe you should form a group and discuss this, because that, again, is not making their job easier. So you might send out something to, let's say, department chairs or math coordinators at districts or principals and say, we would really like you to, at a faculty meeting or a department meeting or some event, discuss some of these key points with your faculty, your teachers, whoever the group is. You might give them some discussion questions. You might give them something short that they could hand out and read first, and then the discussion could be about that. You're helping the people do what you want them to do and helping them process what the information is. If you want them to take action, tell them and be specific. So often I feel like I get an email and I'm pretty sure they want me to do something, but I'm not quite sure what it is. Just be direct. And that you don't obviously want to sound like it's a command, but just say specifically, this is the action we're asking you to take. This is the deadline we'd like you to do it by. It's really frustrating if you are willing to take action and nobody tells you exactly what you're supposed to be doing. Giving input. This one I caution people about a lot. We are in feedback overload in our society. Every service you have, they're asking you to take a survey or whatever. So only ask for input if you really want it, if you can really use it, and if you have time to do that. So, and you need to be really careful about how you frame input. If there are non-negotiables, State that up front, because nothing makes people more angry than when they gave input on something and then you turned around and said, oh yeah, well, we can't really change that part. And that happens, right? So, it may be a policy or a legislation or budget constraints. There may be some kind of constraint that you're just, or it may be a principle. It may be something you just say, no, this is a stake in the ground. We're not going to compromise on this. It's better to tell people up front. Be prepared to use the input, which means if you're going to ask for statewide input, you better be prepared for getting a whole bunch of stuff and how you're going to gather that information into a form that you can actually do something with it, and you need to have the plan of what you're going to do with it before you ask for it. Because it's really bad to be caught off guard and then kind of say to people, well, we had so much input, we kind of weren't able to even look at it. So know what your plan is before you start. Communicate that plan to the people you're asking the input from, because if they know there's a plan, they're more likely to invest their time, because you've invested your time in telling them what you're going to do with that information. Be transparent about the whole process and always respond. And by that, I don't mean yet another email saying thank you for your input. What you need to do is plan for how you will communicate back a summary of what you've heard and what you did with that information. So we all know when you ask for input, you can't act on all of it. In fact, often you get opposite views expressed. It would be impossible to do it all. So that's okay though, as long as you acknowledge we heard this, and those were sort of contradictory, and so this is what we decided. And actually, we've done this in really nice little just brief formats where it's just a table. It said, this is what we heard, and this is why what we decided, and this is why. Because that tells people you respected the fact that they gave you input. And even if you don't decide to do what they asked for, they're much more invested in the process, and they feel like they're part of the process because you've honored their thinking. Okay, so some of the things about this work in particular that are some challenges. And this brought up yesterday, you have some diverse audiences to talk to. There are different sectors, and then there are different roles, which goes all the way from a policy maker to there's administrators, there's math faculty and math teachers, and there's parents. There will eventually probably be, you're going to want to talk to students, there's advisors, there's workforce, all of these different groups. It's going to be very hard to craft a single message for all of those groups. In some cases, you probably do want to try to do that, but in others, you might have some different messaging, not that they would be inconsistent with each other, but different ways that you present the information for those different audiences. Think carefully about terminology. So some of you, this might be surprising, but it actually matters whether you say mathematics or math for certain audiences. Higher education math faculty can get quite upset about this. They like mathematics. It's a tricky issue. Teachers or faculty. So technically, I think I can say high school faculty, and people say, oh yeah, that works. But if I just say faculty, most people will think I'm just talking about higher education. I'm having to kind of train myself about this, because I was originally thinking if I say faculty, it means all of those teachers and instructors and professors, but it didn't communicate that way. Student or kid. In our colleges and universities, we talk about students because a lot of them, they might be older than their faculty members. So we don't talk about kids, but the K-12 system often does. So these are just language issues. Other things have different nuances. Just think about whether you say college, university, higher education, or post-secondary. Technically, you could say those terms are interchangeable within certain contexts, but they have different nuances to different audiences. Sometimes the same word has different meanings in different sectors. So I would not have believed this. I would have always thought discipline, yes, it has different meanings, but the context would make it obvious. So I had a policy person tell me that she was through it was in the third meeting of a committee of K-12 and higher education people before they realized that one of their problems was that they were using discipline in two different meanings. Alignment. K-12 tends to have very specific ideas of what alignment means. Higher education tends to see that in a little higher level, not quite so deep, nitty-gritty stuff. Or a lot of people just don't know what it means at all and pretend they do. So you kind of want to make sure you define, if you're going to talk about alignment, you want to define, does that mean we're getting down to doing mapping of learning outcomes? Does it mean we're kind of talking about general course descriptions? So making sure everyone's on the same page. And this is more about, at first, probably some of your internal communications just within your steering committee and any working groups or the people that you're going to work with. Standards is another one. K-12, that means something very specific. For some sectors of higher education, it will also, especially if they're very connected with their professional associations. But a lot of higher ed faculty will use the term standards as a very general term. We also have a lot of secret codes, and we forget that they're secret codes. In higher education, especially if a state has common course numbering, they tend to just think that when I say math 11, 10, all of you know what that means, right? Of course you do. So you have to remind people, stop and explain use course names. Sometimes you may even need to explain a little bit about what that course does mean. And of course, acronyms and abbreviations, we're all bad about that. We all have our specialized little shorthand. There can be specific policies and practices that we're very familiar with. Like if I go to a California community college faculty member and say AB 705, we just had a whole conversation. That means a lot to that person. But to a high school teacher, it might not, even in California, because they just may not be as aware of this, this legislation that changed the world for community colleges. There can be practices. So, for example, in pedagogy, K-12 teachers know what formative assessment is. There is a segment of higher education faculty who also know what that means because they're very pedagogy-minded. There are a whole lot of faculty in colleges and universities that don't know, and I learned that the hard way when finally somebody asked me in the middle of a presentation of, what do you mean by formative assessment? So that's a common practice in K-12 and certain areas of higher ed, but others are not as familiar with that. And you certainly don't want to ever make somebody feel stupid or like they're not professional. Like, well, what do you mean? How can you have been teaching for 15 years and not what formative assessment is? You want to be respectful from the beginning and understand that in their world, those things have never been surfaced as ideas and techniques. So a lot of this is about relationship building. And that came up yesterday too, that communication is the foundation, and engagement are the foundations of relationship building. So some strategies that you might want to think about is when you have something that you're trying to communicate or you're planning some way to engage people, Ask people from different roles to review. Make sure that somebody from different sectors, or at least somebody who can put on those different hats, looks at it and gives you input. Document what you learn so you remember. Why is it that we need to define that term? Or, this is something that this audience tends not to be as familiar with it. So that you create resources for yourself and for the people that you're working with. Check your assumptions. Don't just, we're so bad, all of us, about making assumptions about groups, either that they do understand something or that they don't. And be really aware of tone and sensitivities. So I think there was a mention yesterday about lack of trust between K-12 and higher ed. That's certainly an issue. And because of that sensitivity, something that could be completely innocuous in another context can be taken to be highly offensive if it sounds like, oh, there goes the higher ed people telling us what to do or blaming us or something like that. So just being really aware of what those sensitivities are and watching. There are also some, trigger words. Doug was joking this morning about the standards that shall not be named, but, there are audiences where you're not going to mention the Common Core standards. So watch out for those things as well. Specifically on some of the questions that were raised by teams, there was a question on how to keep outside parties patient and supportive in process. And as we heard from Jim this morning, these processes, we shouldn't expect that this is like a 6-month project or a year-long project. This is long-term work. And it's a really good question of people do want quick answers, quick solutions. And then also there was what strategies have you used to increase communication between educational levels? And then also, you have a huge audience. You have a lot of districts. You have a lot of colleges, a lot of universities. How do you even manage to engage all of them without having a meeting that looks like this all the time, which of course isn't useful for anyone, and it isn't possible. So a couple things here. One thing you can do if you have this broad constituency with all these different districts, entities, institutions that you need to communicate with them early. Ask them to identify 1 or 2 liaisons who will be the contacts for communication. And then have a real strategy to regularly have communications going out to those folks, and then finding opportunities for engagement. That's something that can be relatively low resource intensive, but can really help them feel like, oh, they remember that we're here. I'm from Colorado, and I'm on the part of the state that isn't next to Denver. And sometimes there is a part of the state that's not next to Denver, in case you didn't know that. Sometimes we felt like they didn't even remember we existed. So, having something that tells every single school district, yes, we know you're there and we know you're important and we want you to be aware of this work. You could have, depending on scale, you might have people on your steering committee of you're the liaison for that region. Twice a year we're going to do a webinar, and you're going to do a webinar for that region. Just make sure that whoever's doing that is supported to have the right messaging, that they know that they're good presenters. You want to think carefully about preparing those people and supporting them to be those liaisons. That gives a face also to people of saying, oh, that's the person I should contact with questions. So, and you can even do that on a website, which is having a picture of, this is the liaison if you're in this region. Contact this person with questions. So those are fairly high-level things. We are going to pass out a handout that has some other strategies. So Katie and Martha are going to start working on that. I'm going to just say a few more things about that you'll see on those strategies. It's really good to have a central location where everybody can go for information. So having a website, it doesn't have to be fancy, but it should be user-friendly in finding information so that people learn, oh, that's always the link I go to. And use that link consistently to remind people that they are, that's the location. I would also say that think about resources you have. Many of you are at universities or colleges that have communications programs. We don't do enough of asking people in our own institutions for help. They might be able to support you, like especially if you have, oh, we really need a nice graphic or a nice handout or something that communicates well, and we're not very good at that. Go and ask those communications departments. It might be a great project for a class, for students, for something like that, or you just might have a faculty member who says, sure, I'd love to help with this. As we just heard last night, you know, even journalists like math, so they might be thrilled to help with this. I also wanted to mention that you heard about the Launch Years project. It's just starting, but one aspect of that is that we are actually bringing in a communications firm to help think about this messaging around these issues of the transition from high school to college. So I know it doesn't help you right now, but 6 to 9 months from now, I hope very much we will start telling you, oh, here's a great resource you might use. So we hope to have some things that we can disseminate that will help all of you. And also, we would really appreciate input from you. I'm asking for input of, as you come up with communication needs, if you could tell us, I will not promise, I'm going to be transparent, I won't promise that we can turn around and meet that need, but the fact that you tell us will help us understand the need and help us think about, well, are there things we could do to try to meet those? So we are just about done with time. Are there 1 or 2 questions that anybody has right now? Okay, I think I'm ready to turn it over to someone, but I don't know who. I'll look at the agenda. Katie. I was going to guess you, but I didn't want to make an assumption.
Right. Okay, we're coming up on the end of the forum. We have just a few things left to do. Let's see. Okay, so just to do a little processing, I know it's after lunch, you're going to need to get up and move here in a minute, and we will let you do that for sure. But just to go through a little bit, you guys did a parking lot earlier of questions that you had about this whole process. What would you ask someone who's got experience with this process? So I thought you might like to see some of the results of that. There were some big patterns that came out in the questions you had. Some of them, we have answers for you, and we are going to get them right out to you. Some of them are very dependent on context, right? So maybe we can provide some examples, but we probably can't answer the question for you. We can give you some guidance on how other people have approached. Some of them we're really going to have to figure out as we move forward, right? So there's different levels of questions, but I thought you might like to just see the high-level questions that people had. So the biggest stack of Post-its was about who to have on the task force. There were some great questions about, do we include students, K-12 and higher ed students? The example we gave you had a bunch of presidents and superintendents listed. Is that the kind of team we need? Well, that really depends on your state. Who do you think is going to have the most influence? In some cases, that works, and in some cases, that's overkill, and maybe not the people who are going to really do the work, right? So all of those things are pretty dependent. I loved that there was a question on how do we ensure there's diversity. I think that's an incredible thing to think about as you're creating your lists. Really thinking forward, someone asked, who are we likely to overlook, right? If we're thinking about someone who's had experience with this, maybe that's one of those things, who did you not invite that we should make sure we invite, kind of lessons learned. And then there were a couple of just statements that this has to be more than the math department that I thought was really great, something to recognize as you're thinking about who to invite. These kinds of questions we can get you some input on pretty quickly, I think. There's a document in the file. Remember I pointed out earlier, there's a document about identifying task force members, so that might help you some, but we can get you some more specifics on this, I think. The next thing was, how do we effectively run the task force meeting? So how many meetings do we have? What's the timing of meetings? There were lots of questions about if I do it during the summer, a lot of the faculty are off, right? Faculty at both higher ed and K-12, so how do we deal with that? Does it matter if we have consistent participation? What if somebody starts and then drops off? What do we do with that kind of thing? Do virtual meetings work in this kind of situation? I can tell you right now, I think a balance of in-person and virtual works fantastically for these meetings. I maybe wouldn't start with the virtual if you can help it, but once you get started, it's great to have virtual meetings. You do not have to meet in person all the time. And then another question, how do we get the supports that are needed? How do we make sure people have time to attend and are funded to attend if we have in-person meetings? Those are great questions that we're really glad that you're thinking about. There were a lot of questions about successes, right? What did you do that made this successful? There were a lot of questions about what did you do that you would do differently next time? What's the challenges that you faced? What are the challenges that you faced? What are the political pitfalls, right? So these are things that we can gather some information for you on, and we'll continue to talk about throughout the process. There was a stack about building trust. How do we actually get consensus? How do we get there? How do we build or repair trust? And how do you make sure everybody feels like they're part of this and not just an additional kind of body? How do we make sure that we have influence, right? How do we get buy-in or support or make sure we're influencing all the stakeholders? And the stakeholders that you guys listed were vast. Some people were very worried about superintendents and state leaders and politicians, and some people were very worried about teachers and faculty. So again, all really great questions. There was a few questions about just what is your role, right? So I spoke to a lot of your teams about the question of who are the decision makers? What is your role as the leadership team? And you guys have to really put the nail in that yourselves, but you need to know that you were brought together for a reason, right? A big part of what we looked at in applications were who has a team that we feel like can really make influence, and it's you guys. So you guys, I want you to feel like you have the power, and you also need to think about who do you need on your side, right? So all of those state agencies and boards and things like that that run things in your community, think about Amy's message about communication and engagement and how to get them on your side. And last but not least, where's the funding for this work? There were lots of questions about where's the funding for this work, and that is definitely something that we're interested in talking with you about, what options you have, what you know about in your state, and if there's things that we can help you with. Not a question that we can obviously answer for you, but we're happy to work with you on that. But I thought it would be interesting that you might like to see kind of the breadth of the questions that we got. So again, some of them will get you information about as soon as possible, especially that creating the task force, because those are really pressing needs. Others we'll address as we move forward, and if you have any specific questions, you can always send them to us. All right, so your brains are probably full and tired, and you're probably thinking about, oh, okay, it's the afternoon on Tuesday. Where are we going from here? So what I want to do, we have on the agenda from 1:10 to 2:10, I think, time for you to do some action planning. So you guys have been thinking a lot about your objective 1 and 2. You're probably thinking about where are we going to go from here. What we'd like to ask you to do is spend the last hour that you have in your team time to really think about what are the actions we need to take. There is a paper version of this document on the back table. So as you leave, if you want a paper version to write on, you can get it. But this document is in the task force folder. It's the T file, or no, maybe U, the very last one. You'll notice when you get this document that it has two sides. They look a lot alike, but one of them says, and you can see on my example up here on the screen, it says by June 1st. And guess what? We've already put some actions in your action planner for you. So think about your task force members and get a draft of that list in the box. We can help to identify, there's a gap here, or you might want to think about those kinds of things. And then, of course, your charge and your problem statement that we've already talked about. The other side of the document is going to be not so immediate. So these are pretty immediate, right? Like in the next few weeks. The other side of the document is things that you're going to want to think about in the next couple of months. We also started that list for you, but not a whole lot of detail there. So what I want you guys to go do is think about what are the steps that need to happen, who is going to do them, and by when. Okay, so I know you have a lot going on in your brain, but try to focus on, we're about to leave here, what needs to happen in the next 3 weeks and then in the next few months. Okay? Just to remind you, deliverables, we gave you 3 deliverables earlier. I'm adding just the orange one is just that action planner. Whatever you decide before the end of the day, if you can get us a copy of that, that'd be great, just so we know what direction you're going. So you've got the folder to upload to for your state leader, and you've got time to go plan. We're going to start back in here with the closing at 2:15, but you've got time to work in your groups in your breakout rooms until then. Thanks, you guys.